Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this workshop session on knowledge-guided machine learning for the hydrological sciences. I wish to highlight the association of this workshop with an NSF-funded KGML grant involving 5 universities. Representatives of those universities are all involved in one way or another in this 3-day workshop. The hydrology group for that grant is represented on this slide, and it involves several universities also. Okay, so I want to refer to the opening session that was held yesterday, Tuesday morning, in which an overall vision for KGML was given. Yesterday afternoon session covered the topic of ML and KGML applied to aquatic sciences. MP4 recordings for the presentations in those 2 sessions were uploaded yesterday evening and are available for your perusal. In the introduction to the current session, I want to give a very brief introduction to a view of KGML as it is applied to hydrological sciences. In this hydrology session, we have domain scientists, hydrologists, and data scientists present. First, starting with the domain scientists, hydrologists in this case, the domain of hydrologists and associated modeling are shown in this slide. Here we have an image of the terrestrial phase of the hydrological cycle. The processes involved in the cycle are very complex, as we would expect. Prior to the advent of digital computers, it was possible to develop very simplified physically based models, mostly based on analytical solutions to simplified process governing equations. However, since the advent of ever more powerful computers, it has been possible to develop ever increasingly complex physically based models representing the components of the hydrological cycle. In general, these models have been developed based on the principles of physics, and in many cases, the principles of chemistry and biology are also used for associated chemical and biological processes that are incorporated into the models. An example output from a complex physically based hydrologic model is shown here to the right of the diagram. It compares observed and modeled streamflow for a watershed in southeastern Minnesota. Some of the challenges for physically based hydrologic modeling are listed here. I'll just talk about a couple of those, or I'll talk about those at this point. So for instance, model complexity, there's the question about how many process components should be represented in the model, how detailed those process components should be represented, et cetera. System heterogeneity is another big challenge in that, a watershed might contain dozens to hundreds of different types of soils, varying topography, different vegetative populations, different land uses, and so forth. Spatial and temporal scales are also important. Calibration is a big challenge as well. That is how to get a reasonable optimum set of parameters for representing a particular site. Model transfer is a challenge. That is how to move from a calibrated situation to an ungaged basin, or as in data science language, out of sample. And then lastly, I'll just mention non-stationarity of inputs as being a big challenge. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. Climate variations, that is the variations that cause differences in inputs that are uncertain, and then changes in land use that are brought about by human activities. From the data scientist perspective, there's an attempt to simulate or predict hydrological processes as well, and we're starting to see a lot more applications of that nature. Models are generally based on statistical time series methods such as ARIMA, SARIMA, NARCS, etc. It should be noted that many hydrologists have used time series methods a lot in the past and still do now. For data learning, which is an emerging area in the data scientist domain for hydrology, that is an area that's that we're talking about today. And I want to mention that there are many hydrologists now that are starting to apply these methods. An example simulation of the same watershed that was shown in the previous slide, simulation of or emulation of the stream flow compared to the observed data is shown here based on a LSTM machine learning model. Some challenges for machine learning models are, for instance, getting adequate data for a particular situation to be able to train and test the model. The model may violate principles. This was discussed a lot yesterday, such as conservation of mass, conservation of energy, and so forth. And we want to make sure the model doesn't do that. So that's a big challenge to build the architecture so it doesn't do that. How to build model architecture to capture highly nonlinear behavior, which we see in hydrological processes. And then, of course, transfer to out of sample situations. And there was a lot of discussion of that yesterday in the aquatic sciences section of the session yesterday afternoon. Some opportunities that I want to mention here, and we've listed these to kind of excite the data scientists because of the massive amounts of data that are available. There's hundreds to maybe thousands of terabytes of data that are available. And I list here some of the sources of data that are either federal or state programs for experimental watersheds. There's scientific observatories, CCOs, NEON, GLEON, national and international data sources, and so forth. And of course, NASA, USDA, USGS, ISRIC, so forth. Those are organizations that have massive amounts of data. As I mentioned, it runs in the hundreds to thousands of terabytes of information. I'm going to mention, or I think that Chris Duffy in his presentation is going to talk a bit when he's talking about some work at a CZO about data rescue, and that there's a lot of data out there that is underutilized in the hydrologic modeling field. So this last slide kind of refers to the need to bring it all together. We've got the hydrologists with their physically based models on one side. We got the data scientists with their ML models on the other side. And the opportunity or challenge is to guide the development of ML models by implicitly or explicitly imposing physics principles into the ML architecture. The idea is to combine two approaches to identify the pathway to more accurate predictions. Of course, the effort will require close collaboration between the domain scientists and the data scientists, and we're starting to see a lot of that collaboration going on in some of these funding programs. So I know you did not join this session to listen to me talk. Fortunately, we have six really excellent presentations today. The presentations are variable duration, but all have been set up with the idea to leave about 5 minutes for questions at the end of each presentation. And you can submit your questions by Slido. And I list here the presentations. So with that, we're going to move on, and Gray Nearing from the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, is going to give the first presentation.